It was a cold autumn afternoon when I found myself standing outside a small crematorium on the edge of town. A light drizzle had settled over everything, turning the car park into a patchwork of dull reflections. The trees had already begun shedding their leaves, and every gust of wind sent another handful drifting silently across the pavement. People walked past carrying black umbrellas, speaking in hushed voices. I wasn't there for a funeral. Not this time. I was waiting. Inside that building was the woman I had once believed I would spend the rest of my life with. She wasn't saying goodbye to a husband or a parent. She was saying goodbye to the life she'd known before strangers on the internet stole it from her. I remember standing there with my hands buried deep inside my coat pockets, wondering how two people who had never truly met could both lose so much. Looking back now, everyone asks the same question. How could you possibly have fallen for it? The honest answer isn't flattering. When you're 25, loneliness tells you to go out with your mates. When you're 45, it tells you to throw yourself into work. But when you're nearly 70, loneliness whispers something entirely different. It tells you this may be your last chance. That's the part people don't always understand. 5 years after my wife died, I wasn't searching for excitement. I wasn't chasing romance. I wasn't trying to relive my youth. I simply missed hearing another voice in the house. Missed making 2 cups of tea instead of 1. Missed having someone ask how my day had been. Those little things become surprisingly important once they're gone. So, when someone appeared who seemed to understand exactly what it felt like to lose the person you'd built your whole life around, I wanted to believe it. Perhaps I needed to. The strange thing is that everything fell apart because of one favor. Just one. Not thousands of pounds. Not some wild investment. Not anything that sounded obviously dangerous. At first, nobody asked me to lend money. Nobody promised instant riches. Nobody pressured me. It was a simple request between 2 people who trusted each other. Or at least, I thought we did. If I'd refused that one favor, I'd still have my savings. My children might never have stopped speaking to me. Old friendships wouldn't have been damaged. An innocent widow would never have found herself answering painful questions from neighbors who suddenly believed terrible things about her. And I would never have spent months wondering whether kindness itself had become something to fear. There isn't a single day that passes when I don't replay that week in my mind. Sometimes I convince myself I could have spotted the warning signs. Other times, I remember how convincing everything seemed while I was living through it. That's the danger. When you're inside the story, it never feels like a scam. It feels like ordinary life. It feels like helping someone you care about. If someone had stopped me that week, if someone had persuaded me to wait just 24 hours, none of what followed would have happened. Instead, one small decision gathered momentum like a snowball rolling downhill, growing larger and more destructive until it swept away almost everything either of us still believed in. As I watched another family leave the crematorium that afternoon, I realized the woman inside wasn't mourning a person. She was mourning her reputation, her peace of mind, her trust in other people, and standing there in the rain, I found myself asking the question that still keeps me awake some nights. Who was this widow? And how did one simple favor become the beginning of a catastrophe neither of us could escape? 5 years before that afternoon outside the crematorium, my life had become painfully predictable. I was 69. Retired after more than 4 decades working as a railway engineer. Most of my career had been spent keeping trains moving across North Yorkshire, solving problems before passengers ever knew they existed. I used to think retirement would be a reward. Instead, it became something I had to learn how to survive. My wife, Aine, had died after a long illness. For 43 years we'd shared the same routines, the same worries, and the same little jokes that no one else would ever understand. Losing her wasn't like closing one chapter of my life. It felt as though someone had quietly torn half the pages from the book. I still lived in our modest semi-detached house just outside York. Our daughter was in Manchester. Our son had settled near Bristol. They rang when they could, and they visited whenever work and family allowed. I never blamed them for having busy lives. Anne and I had spent years encouraging them to build those lives. Even so, The telephone seemed to ring less often with every passing month. The silence in the house became something I noticed before I'd even opened my eyes each morning. Most days followed the same pattern. I'd wake just after 6, put the kettle on, and make 1 mug of tea instead of 2. For months after Anne died, I still reached for a second cup without thinking. Old habits don't disappear because someone does. After breakfast, I'd take my Labrador, Barney, for a walk around the village. He had become my most faithful companion, always waiting patiently by the front door with a lead in his mouth, blissfully unaware that he was often the only reason I left the house before lunchtime. Afterwards, I'd stop at the little cafe on the high street. The young waitress knew my order before I sat down. Usual tea. "Mr. Wilson, if you don't mind." She'd smile, disappear into the kitchen, and return with a steaming mug and a slice of fruit loaf. There was comfort in being recognized. There was also sadness. Sometimes that brief exchange was the longest conversation I'd have all day. Back home, I'd spend an hour in the garden, pulling weeds or trimming hedges that never seemed to stop growing. Anne had adored her flower beds, and I did my best to keep them looking as she would have wanted. On rainy afternoons, I'd settle into my armchair and watch old quiz shows. I'd answer the questions aloud. Occasionally, I'd even glance towards Anne's empty chair, expecting her to laugh when I got one wrong. By evening, the daylight had already faded. I'd lock the front door, make myself something simple for supper, and wonder why the hours between 7 and bedtime always felt so impossibly long. Sundays were different. Church gave me somewhere to be and familiar faces to greet. But I couldn't help noticing how many of those faces gradually disappeared. One friend moved into a care home after a stroke. Another lost his battle with cancer. One couple simply stopped coming because driving had become too difficult. Every year the congregation grew a little smaller. So did my world. Christmas was the hardest of all. The first one without Anne had felt unbearable. By the 5th, the pain had softened, but it hadn't gone away. I noticed couples choosing presents together in the shops, families laughing over coffee, hands held across restaurant tables. I was happy for them. I truly was. But I'd be lying if I said I never wondered whether that part of my own life had quietly come to an end. One Sunday evening, my daughter rang. "Dad," she said gently, "have you ever thought about joining Facebook?" I laughed. What would I want with Facebook? You might find old school friends, people you've lost touch with. I'm a bit old for all that. Nonsense. Half my neighbors are on it. You don't have to post photographs of your dinner. I smiled despite myself. I'm serious. So won't we? After a long pause, I finally said, "Perhaps I'll have a look." The truth was, I wasn't searching for romance. I wasn't hoping to fall in love again. If someone had asked me then what I wanted, my answer would have been painfully simple. I just hoped that, somewhere out there, an old friend might send a message, saying, "Hello. It's been years. How have you been?" I had no idea that one innocent decision to reconnect with the world online was about to change the course of the rest of my life. I almost forgot about Facebook after setting up the account. For the first week or two, it felt rather pointless. A few familiar names appeared from school, though most had changed so much. I wasn't entirely certain who they were. I clicked like on photographs of grandchildren I'd never met, wished old colleagues happy birthdays, and quietly observed everyone else's lives from a distance. It was enough. At least, that's what I told myself. Then, one Thursday morning, while Barney was asleep beside my chair and the kettle had only just boiled, a small notification appeared. Message request. I frowned. Hardly anyone ever sent me messages. I clicked it open. "Good morning. I hope you don't mind me saying hello. I recognized your name from a railway history group, and your smile reminded me of someone kind." Her name was Margaret. Her profile picture showed a woman of about 66, standing beside a flower bed filled with lavender. She wasn't dressed elegantly. There was no expensive jewelry. No glamorous holiday photographs or polished poses. Just a cardigan, a gentle smile, and a pair of eyes that somehow looked familiar, not because I'd seen her before, because they carried the same sadness I'd seen in my own reflection. I nearly ignored the message. After all, I joined Facebook to reconnect with old friends, not make new ones. Still, there was something polite about the way she'd written. No pressure, no awkward compliments, simply a friendly greeting. I typed back, "Thank you. I don't mind at all. I hope you're keeping well." That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning. Margaret replied later that afternoon. She lived in Devon, in a small town not far from the coast. She'd been widowed 3 years earlier, after her husband died from cancer. "I still expect to hear his key in the front door," she admitted one evening. I stared at the screen before replying. "I still catch myself making 2 cups of tea." A minute passed. Then she wrote, "I thought I was the only person who still did things like that." I smiled. Not because the conversation was exciting, because it felt honest. Over the following weeks, our messages became part of my day. We discovered we both loved gardening. She struggled to grow tomatoes. I confessed mine rarely survived the Yorkshire weather. She enjoyed old detective dramas. I admitted I still watched repeats of Time's Midsummer Murders Times, even though I already knew who the murderer was. She laughed. "So do I." We talked about holidays we'd taken years ago. Whitby, Scarborough, the Lake District. She told me how much she loved hearing the sea on windy evenings. I confessed I'd always preferred beaches in winter. Less crowded, I said, and somehow more peaceful. "I've always thought exactly the same," she replied. The conversations never felt forced. There was no need to impress one another. We spoke about grandchildren, aching knees, favorite puddings, and how strange retirement could sometimes feel. Eventually, Margaret suggested we move our conversations to WhatsApp. It'll be easier than checking Facebook all the time. It seemed perfectly sensible. Within days, we were exchanging messages every morning. "Morning. Sleep any better?" "A little. How about you?" She remembered everything. If I'd mentioned a hospital appointment, she'd ask how it had gone. If Barney had been limping, she'd ask whether the vet thought it was serious. On the anniversary of Anne's death, she sent a simple message. "Thinking of you today." You don't have to reply. Nobody outside my family had remembered that date before. That small act of kindness stayed with me. For the first time in years, someone wasn't simply asking whether I was all right. They genuinely seemed to care about the answer. Without noticing, I found myself looking forward to my phone buzzing. The mornings no longer felt quite so empty. The evenings passed more quickly. Even Barney seemed to benefit from my brighter mood. Wagging his tail whenever, I laughed at something she'd written. One afternoon, Mrs. Peterson from next door caught me trimming the hedge. "You seem happier these days." I looked up, surprised. "Do I? You've been smiling to yourself all week." A few days later, my daughter rang. "You sound different." "Dad." "In what way?" "Lighter." I hesitated before telling her about Margaret. She listened quietly. When I'd finished, she smiled. "I think it's lovely. You found someone to talk to." So did I. Yet sometimes, late at night after we'd said goodnight, a tiny thought would creep into the back of my mind. How could someone I'd never met understand me so completely? And why did a perfectly ordinary friendship already feel almost too perfect? Before I knew it, spring had given way to summer. Somehow, Margaret had become part of my everyday routine without either of us ever deciding that she should. Every morning, just before 7, my phone would buzz. "Morning. Did Barney let you sleep?" I'd smile before I even unlocked the screen. Not a chance. He decided 5:30 was perfectly reasonable. She'd send a laughing emoji and tell me she'd already been out watering her roses. Those little exchanges became as familiar as putting the kettle on. After breakfast, we'd often have a video call. Nothing grand. Sometimes she'd be sitting in her kitchen with a mug of tea, Other times she'd be in her garden, apologizing because the wind made it difficult to hear. "You're getting more sunshine than we are." I'd tease, "That's Devon for you." She'd laugh. Occasionally, we'd even eat lunch together over the screen. I'd have a cheese sandwich. She'd be making soup. We'd chat about the news, complain about supermarket prices, or argue, good-naturedly, over which county made the best Yorkshire puddings. There was something oddly comforting about sharing ordinary moments. Neither of us felt the need to entertain the other. Just having company was enough. On my 70th birthday, a card arrived through the post. Inside was a simple handwritten message. "I hope this year brings you more reasons to smile than the last one did." Tucked inside was a packet of sweet pea seeds. "For your garden." I think Anne would have approved. I sat quietly at the kitchen table for several minutes. It wasn't an expensive gift. That wasn't the point. Someone had thought about me. Someone had remembered. Later that evening, I thanked Margaret during our call. "You didn't have to do that." I wanted to. "It's been a long time since anyone surprised me." She smiled softly. "Everyone deserves a birthday that feels special." It was such a simple sentence, yet it stayed with me long after we ended the call. Margaret never tried to become the center of my life. In fact, she often encouraged me to spend time with other people. "Have you been to the allotment lately?" she'd ask. "You've neglected those tomatoes." Another time she reminded me to ring my grandson before his driving test. "Family comes first," she said. "You'll never regret making time for them." Hearing that made me trust her even more. "A manipulative person," I thought, would surely want all my attention. Margaret seemed to want exactly the opposite. As the months passed, we began talking about meeting. Nothing extravagant, just somewhere sensible. "Birmingham's probably fair," she suggested one evening. "It's halfway for both of us." I nodded. "That sounds perfect." We even laughed about how awkward it might feel after so many months of talking. "What if we don't recognize each other?" I joked. "I'll be the nervous widow carrying far too much luggage. And I'll probably be the anxious Yorkshireman looking in completely the wrong direction." The thought of finally meeting filled me with excitement I'd almost forgotten was possible. Now and then, though, practical matters interrupted our plans. Margaret explained that her late husband's estate was still going through probate. I thought it would have been sorted months ago. She sighed. "There always seems to be another form or another delay." She sounded embarrassed whenever the subject came up. "I hate talking about money." "You don't have to. I've always managed my own affairs." She paused before adding quietly, "I never want anyone to rescue me." That sentence settled something inside me. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. There was pride in her voice. Dignity. She never complained. Never asked for sympathy. She simply wanted to put her life back together. The more I listened, the more convinced I became that she was exactly who she claimed to be. Even my friends noticed the change. "You've got your spark back," Brian from church said after the Sunday service. "I haven't seen you smile this much in years." I laughed. Perhaps I'm finally learning how to live again. Walking home that afternoon, I realized something that would once have seemed impossible. For the first time since losing Anne, I wasn't just remembering the happiness I'd had. I was beginning to imagine happiness still to come, and that frightened me almost as much as it excited me. Because if Margaret was so careful about her independence, if she disliked talking about money so much, why would that suddenly begin to change? If anyone had asked me then whether I trusted Margaret, I'd have answered without a moment's hesitation. Yes. Completely. Trust, I discovered, rarely arrives all at once. It builds itself quietly through ordinary days. Small conversations, and the comforting feeling that someone genuinely cares whether you've slept well or remembered to put the bins out. By the end of summer, speaking to Margaret had become as natural as making my morning tea, which is why the first little changes were so easy to overlook. One Monday morning, her usual message never arrived. I wasn't worried at first. People oversleep. Phones run out of battery. Life gets in the way. It wasn't until late that evening that my phone finally buzzed. "I'm terribly sorry. I've been at the hospital all day with my sister. I'll explain tomorrow. The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable. The next evening she called, sounding exhausted. I'm afraid she's had another fall. Is she all right? We're hoping so. I'm sorry you've had such a dreadful day. Nothing about the conversation felt unusual. If anything, she seemed embarrassed for disappearing. A fortnight later, it happened again. This time she vanished for nearly 3 days. When she eventually returned, she apologized before I could ask any questions. The internet's been dreadful. You should complain. I have. They're hopeless. We both laughed. And the matter was forgotten. Or at least, I convinced myself it was. As autumn approached, I began noticing other little things. Nothing dramatic, just tiny details that didn't quite fit together. One evening she referred to a solicitor's appointment as though it had already happened. The following day she spoke about it as though it were still scheduled for the week ahead. When I mentioned the difference, she chuckled. Oh dear. I can't keep track anymore. Too much on your mind. I'm afraid so. It seemed an entirely believable answer. After all, I'd forgotten plenty of appointments myself over the years. Then there were her messages. Most sounded exactly as they always had. Warm, gentle, thoughtful, but every so often, one would arrive that felt oddly different. The sentences were shorter, the wording slightly unfamiliar, almost as though another person had written them. When I teased her about it, she laughed. I've started using voice-to-text on my phone. Does it work? Not particularly. It keeps changing what I say. I thought you'd suddenly become much more formal. She laughed again. I'll blame technology. I laughed with her. Looking back, I realized how desperately I wanted every explanation to be true. One afternoon we arranged a video call. While I was sitting in the conservatory, Barney was asleep at my feet. Margaret answered, smiling as always. For 10 peaceful minutes we chatted about the weather and whether I'd managed to rescue my tomatoes from another early frost. Then, quite suddenly, her expression changed. She looked over her shoulder. Oh. What is it? Nothing. A muffled voice seemed to come from somewhere beyond the camera. She quickly smiled again. I'm so sorry. David, I really have to go. Before I could reply, the screen went black. I stared at my own reflection. It was the first time she'd ever ended a conversation so abruptly. A small voice inside me whispered that something wasn't quite right. Another voice answered almost immediately. Don't be ridiculous. People get interrupted. That evening, my daughter Sarah came round for supper. As we cleared away the plates, she asked casually, so, when do I finally get to meet Margaret? I smiled. Soon. I hope. What about a video call? I'm sure she'd like that. Have you asked her? Not yet. Sarah hesitated. I'd just feel happier if we all said hello. When I mentioned the idea to Margaret the following day, she sounded uncomfortable. I'd love to. She paused. But perhaps after everything with probate is settled. Why wait? I don't want your family forming opinions before they really know me. It wasn't an unreasonable answer. Grief affects people differently. Some become very private. Margaret had always struck me as one of those people. When I told Sarah, she frowned. Doesn't that seem a bit odd? No. Not even slightly. I shook my head. She's been through a great deal. Sarah didn't argue, but I could see she wasn't convinced. For the first time, I found myself defending Margaret instead of simply talking about her. Not because I had proof, because I couldn't bear the thought that suspicion might destroy something that had brought so much light back into my life. As I lay awake that night, listening to the rain, tapping softly against the bedroom window, one question quietly settled into my mind. Were these nothing more than ordinary misunderstandings? Or was I beginning to see the first tiny cracks in something I desperately wanted to believe was real? For nearly a week after Sarah's visit, everything felt normal again. Margaret was cheerful. We spoke every morning, laughed about Barney stealing my slippers, and even started discussing dates for meeting in Birmingham before Christmas. It felt as though the awkwardness had passed. I almost forgot the little doubts that had been creeping into my mind. Then, one Tuesday evening, her voice sounded different. Not frightened. Embarrassed. "David." "What's the matter?" She hesitated for so long that I wondered whether the call had frozen. "I need to ask you something." I smiled. "You know you can ask me anything." I've been telling myself not to. Why? Because I never wanted to become someone who depends on other people. There was that familiar pride again. The same quiet determination I'd admired from the beginning. I waited. My solicitor has been trying to finalize the probate. I thought things were nearly sorted. So did I. She let out a tired sigh. The money is finally being released. But there's a delay with the bank. I'm sorry. It should only take a few days. I listened carefully. Nothing about what she said sounded impossible. Anyone who had dealt with solicitors knew how slowly paperwork could move. Then she spoke again. I wondered. Her voice almost disappeared. "Whether you might do me one small favor." "What sort of favor?" "It isn't borrowing money." She answered so quickly that I almost laughed. "I'd never ask you for that." The relief I felt was immediate. "So what do you need?" "The funds from my late husband's estate are due to arrive. But because of this banking delay," my solicitor suggested, transferring them into another account temporarily. I frowned, trying to understand. My account, only for a few days. She rushed on before I could respond. "The money would arrive in your bank. And then you'd simply transfer it to my solicitor. That's all. That's all." It sounds rather straightforward. It is. She paused. "I just feel awful asking." I leaned back in my chair. It didn't feel risky. The money wasn't mine. I wasn't lending anything. I was simply helping someone I trusted while her bank sorted out a temporary problem. People did favors for each other all the time, don't they? Still. Something made me hesitate. I've never done anything like that before. I know. If you'd rather say no. I completely understand. She sounded genuinely disappointed. But not angry. I'll find another way. The silence that followed was almost harder to bear than the request itself. For months, she'd never asked me for anything. Not once. She'd encouraged me to spend time with my family. She'd reminded me to look after myself. She'd listened whenever I talked about Anne. Now, for the first time, she needed my help. What sort of man would I be if I refused? "I'll do it." She let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. "Are you sure?" "Of course. I honestly don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed. You've no idea what this means to me." 2 days later, exactly as she'd described, the money appeared in my account. Just over £9,000. The payment reference looked perfectly ordinary. There was nothing to suggest anything unusual. Margaret rang within minutes. "It came through." "Yes." "Oh. Thank goodness." She sounded close to tears. "My solicitor's details are in the email I sent you." I opened the message. Everything appeared professional. A solicitor's name, a bank account, a reference number. I logged into my online banking and carefully copied every detail. Before confirming the transfer, I paused for a moment. It wasn't fear, just the natural caution anyone feels before moving a large sum of money. Then, I reminded myself of something Margaret had said months earlier. I never want anyone to rescue me. This wasn't rescuing her. It was simply helping for a few days. I clicked, confirm. The money left my account almost immediately. That evening Margaret called again. "You've taken such a weight off my shoulders." "I'm glad. I'll never forget your kindness." Neither of us realized it then. But that single transfer had changed everything. Because although the money had passed through my account exactly as she described, it had never belonged to Margaret at all. So, if it wasn't hers, whose money had I just sent? For the first few days after forwarding the money, I thought nothing more about it. Margaret sounded happier than she had in weeks. The solicitor confirmed everything arrived. She told me during one of our evening calls. I knew it would. I can finally breathe again. Hearing the relief in her voice filled me with a quiet sense of satisfaction. After months of listening to her worries about paperwork and probate. I'd finally been able to help. It felt good. Useful. For the first time since Anne had died. Someone genuinely needed me. That feeling stayed with me far longer than I realized. Then, one Saturday morning, Sarah appeared at my front door, carrying 2 coffees. I thought we could have a proper catch-up, she said, as we sat in the conservatory, Barney resting between us. She glanced towards my laptop on the table. Dad, can I ask you something? Go on. Have you been doing more online banking recently? The question caught me off guard. A little. She hesitated. I noticed a notification from your bank when I helped you update your tablet last week. Oh. That. It looked like quite a large payment. I felt my shoulders tense. It wasn't my money. What do you mean? Before I had time to think, I explained about Margaret's solicitor and the temporary banking delay. Sarah's expression changed almost immediately. You let money go through your account. It was only a favor. Whose money was it? Margaret's. How do you know? I frowned. Because she told me. Dad. Her voice softened. Did you actually see any paperwork? I saw the solicitor's details. Did you ring the solicitor? No. She looked down into her coffee. I don't like this. There's nothing to worry about. You don't know that. I trust her. Sarah Sahil. I know you do. That afternoon she rang my brother. And by Sunday my son Daniel had driven over from Bristol. I knew the moment he walked through the door that Sarah had told him everything. He didn't waste time. Dad, this doesn't sound right. It isn't what you're imagining. Maybe not. He sat opposite me. But people our age are being targeted every day. Margaret isn't one of those people. How can you be certain? Because I know her. You've never actually met her. The room fell silent. It was the same sentence Sarah had used. The same doubt. The same fear. Later that evening, Daniel searched online while I watched from the armchair. Page after page appeared. Stories about romance. Scams. Victims who believed they were helping someone they cared about. Bank transfers. Solicitors. Temporary emergencies. Even money passing through someone else's account. I felt irritation rising inside me. You're making everything fit because you've already decided she's guilty. Dad. Daniel replied quietly. I'm trying to stop you getting hurt. But she's different. Every victim says that. The words landed harder than he intended. I stood up. You don't know her. No. I do. Sarah looked at me with tears in her eyes. Then let us speak to her. Why? So we can understand. The request seemed reasonable enough. When I mentioned it to Margaret that evening, she became noticeably unsettled. I don't think that's a good idea. Why not? They've already decided they dislike me. They haven't. I'd only make things worse. They simply want to meet you. A long silence followed. Finally, she whispered. I've spent years trying to rebuild my confidence after losing Peter. I know. I don't think I could bear feeling judged by your family. Hearing the hurt in her voice made my heart sink. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. Perhaps we should stop talking for a while. My stomach tightened. What? I never wanted to come between you and your children. You aren't. I think I am. No. If speaking to me is causing arguments, it isn't worth losing your family. The thought of her disappearing completely filled me with panic. I'd already lost Anne. I'd watched friends disappear through illness and old age. I couldn't face another goodbye. Please don't go. I'm only trying to do what's best. What's best is that we stay together. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I was hoping you'd say that. After we ended the call, I sat alone in the darkness for a long time. My children's warnings echoed in one ear. Margaret's quiet tears echoed in the other. Without realizing it, I'd reached the point where the fear of losing her had become greater than the fear of being deceived. Lying awake that night, I asked myself the question I should have faced weeks earlier. Had loneliness blinded me completely? Or had someone carefully learned how to use it against me? The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was trimming the hedge. I almost ignored it. The number wasn't familiar. Mr. Wilson. Speaking. This is Detective Inspector Reeves from North Yorkshire Police. Would you be able to come into the station this afternoon? We need to discuss some recent activity on your bank account. For a moment I thought there must have been some mistake. My bank account? Yes. Sir. Have I done something wrong? I'd rather explain everything in person. The journey into town felt far longer than it normally did. I kept replaying the conversation with Margaret from the previous evening. She'd sounded perfectly normal. She'd wished Barney a happy birthday, something she'd remembered from a passing comment I'd made weeks earlier. Surely someone capable of such kindness couldn't be connected to anything criminal. Could they? The detective greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a quiet interview room. There was no hostility, only concern. A folder lay on the table between us. Mr. Wilson. He began gently. We believe your account has recently received and forwarded money connected to a fraud investigation. I stared at him. I'm sorry. What? He slid a sheet of paper towards me. It showed the transfer I'd made for Margaret's solicitor. The funds that entered your account did not originate from a probate payment. They were Margaret's. We don't believe they were. My mouth went dry. There has to be some mistake. We wish there were. He explained that several elderly people across England had reported losing substantial sums of money through sophisticated scams. One victim had transferred savings believing they were investing for retirement. Another had been tricked into paying fake building invoices. The stolen money had then been moved through a series of ordinary bank accounts. Mine was one of them. A money mule. The detective said quietly, I didn't know. We believe that. I never kept a penny. We know. For the first time since arriving. I felt my shoulders loosen slightly. I wasn't being treated like a criminal. I was being treated like someone who had been manipulated. Even so, the shame settled heavily inside me. Everything I'd believed was beginning to crumble. Then the detective showed me something I never expected. A photograph. It was Margaret, or at least, the woman I'd believed was Margaret. Do you recognize her? Of course. He nodded. So did several other victims. I frowned. Victims. This photograph belongs to a real woman. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Her name really is Margaret. My heart skipped. She's genuinely 66. She really did lose her husband to cancer. She really does live in Devon. For one impossible second, I hope rushed back into me. I knew it. But the detective slowly shook his head. The problem is, he turned another photograph towards me. The real Margaret has never spoken to you. I felt as though the room had tilted. Months earlier, he explained. Criminals had copied her Facebook photographs, personal details, and public posts before creating convincing fake accounts in her name. The woman whose messages had changed my life had been hiding behind someone else's identity all along. The real Margaret had no idea. By the time police traced her, neighbors had already begun whispering. Old friends had stopped replying to her messages. Even members of her late husband's family had questioned whether she'd been involved. Her reputation had been quietly destroyed by something she'd never even known was happening. A week later, with her agreement, the police arranged for us to meet. I almost canceled. I wasn't sure either of us could face it. She was waiting in a small meeting room when I arrived. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked exactly like the photographs I'd stared at for nearly a year. The same gentle smile, the same silver hair, the same eyes. Only this time, they were filled with exhaustion. I'm so sorry. She whispered before I could say a word. I shook my head. You've nothing to apologize for. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I thought I'd been careful online. So did I. They've taken my name. They've taken much more than that. We sat together for over an hour, not as two people whose love story had fallen apart, but as two complete strangers whose lives had been damaged by the very same criminals. By the time we stood to leave, one thing had become painfully clear. The thieves hadn't just stolen money. They had stolen trust, identity, peace of mind, and the simple belief that kindness was safe. As I walked back to my car, the detective caught up with me. "We're expanding the investigation," he said. "We think we've identified several members of the network." I looked back at the building where the real Margaret still sat quietly inside. Then I asked the only question that mattered. After everything that had been taken from both of us, could either of us ever learn to trust another person again? In the weeks that followed, my life became a strange mixture of police interviews, paperwork, and long periods of quiet reflection. I handed over everything. Every WhatsApp message, every photograph, every email, even the birthday card Margaret's impersonator had persuaded me was genuine. The detectives treated each item as evidence. To me, they felt like pieces of a life that had never really existed. Detective Inspector Reeves kept me updated whenever there was progress. One Friday afternoon he rang. "We've made several arrests." I sat down without realizing I was doing it. "They've found them. Some of them." He explained that officers from several police forces had been working together for months. The fraud network stretched across different parts of the country, with links overseas. Some people had stolen identities. Others had handled bank accounts and false documents. A few had been responsible for persuading lonely people to trust complete strangers. It wasn't one criminal. It was an organized business built on other people's grief. The police searched addresses, seized computers and mobile phones, and recovered thousands of messages sent to victims all over Britain. Many of those messages followed almost identical patterns. The same compliments, the same stories, the same promises, only the names had changed. Weeks later, I was asked to provide a witness statement. Reading through months of conversations was far harder than I expected. I remembered exactly how I'd felt when each message arrived. Hope, relief, excitement. Now I could see the manipulation hidden between the lines. The pauses had been deliberate. The sympathy had been rehearsed. Even the timing of the messages had been carefully planned. I wasn't reading a love story anymore. I was reading a script. Not all the money was recovered. Mine certainly wasn't. A small amount was traced to frozen accounts. But most had disappeared long before the arrests were made. Oddly enough, by then I found myself grieving something else more than the savings. I mourned the confidence I'd lost. The certainty that I could recognize a genuine person from a dishonest one. One afternoon, Detective Reeves smiled for the first time since we'd met. "I've some good news." I looked up. "The Crown Prosecution Service has decided there'll be no action against you." I frowned. "I still transferred the money." "You did. But our investigation confirmed you had no knowledge that it was criminal property." He paused before adding, "You were manipulated into acting as what we call a money mule." Hearing those words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I had made a terrible mistake, but I hadn't been a criminal. I had been another victim. A month later, in the local community center, invited me to speak during a fraud awareness afternoon. My first instinct was to refuse. I wasn't sure I wanted strangers, knowing how easily I'd been deceived. Then I remembered how many people had stayed silent because they felt ashamed. Perhaps that silence was exactly what the criminals relied upon. So I stood before a room full of pensioners with a cup of tea trembling gently in my hand. I used to think scams only happened to careless people. I admitted, I couldn't have been more wrong. The room was completely still. Afterwards, several people came over to thank me. One gentleman confessed he'd recently started talking to someone online, but had begun noticing similarities to my story. Another lady admitted she'd been too embarrassed to tell her son about suspicious messages she'd received. For the first time, what had happened to me seemed capable of helping someone else. A few weeks later, I received a call from the real Margaret. "Would you mind if I joined you at the next meeting?" Not at all. When she stood beside me the following month, there was no bitterness in her voice. She spoke about having her identity stolen, about watching lifelong friends begin to doubt her, about the loneliness that followed. Then she smiled gently. "If sharing our experience stops even one person becoming a victim, something good will have come from all this." People listened, not because our story was extraordinary, but because it could have happened to almost anyone. Justice had finally arrived. Not perfectly. Most of the stolen money was gone forever. Some victims would never recover financially. Others would always carry the emotional scars. Yet the people responsible had been exposed. Their lies had come to an end, as Margaret and I locked the community center together that evening. She looked at me and quietly said, "I never imagined we'd meet like this." Neither did I. We stood for a moment in the cool Yorkshire air before walking towards our cars. Neither of us had found the future we'd once imagined, but perhaps we'd found something different. After everything we'd endured, could two strangers, wounded by the same invisible crime, slowly help each other, learn to trust the world again? It was early spring when Margaret and I found ourselves walking along the Yorkshire coast. The sea was calm, though the wind still carried that familiar chill that never quite leaves the East Coast. No matter the season, we weren't in any hurry. There was no destination, just two people strolling along the promenade with paper cups of tea warming our hands. If someone had told me a year earlier that I'd one day be walking beside the real Margaret, I would have imagined a very different ending. Perhaps a love story. Perhaps a second chance at happiness. Life, I've learned, rarely follows the stories we invent for ourselves. The woman beside me wasn't the person I'd fallen in love with online. She never had been. She was simply another ordinary person whose life had been quietly turned upside down by criminals she'd never met. For months after the investigation, she'd struggled to trust anyone. Some neighbors had avoided her. Old friends had apologized for believing rumors. But apologies couldn't completely erase the hurt. I'd experienced something similar. People had been kind. Yet I couldn't shake the embarrassment of knowing how easily I'd been deceived. Trust doesn't return overnight. It comes back one small moment at a time. Margaret smiled as we stopped to watch the waves rolling against the seawall. "I used to think I'd never enjoy coming to the seaside again," she said. "So did I." She laughed softly. "Funny how life surprises you." It certainly does. We found a little cafe overlooking the harbor and ordered tea with 2 slices of fruit cake. Nothing fancy. Exactly the sort of place Anne and I had always enjoyed. For a while we simply watched people passing outside. Families with children. An elderly couple, sharing chips. A man throwing a ball for his dog along the beach. Ordinary life carried on, as it always does. "I'm glad we met," Margaret said quietly. I looked at her and smiled. "So long." Not because of what happened. No. But because we both understand something most people never have to. I nodded. "You don't have to explain it." "No. We've both lived it." There was no romance between us. No promises. No talk of forever. What grew instead was something steadier. A friendship built not on illusions, but on honesty. Neither of us pretended the past hadn't happened. Neither of us tried to erase it. We simply chose not to let it define the rest of our lives. These days, I spend far more time with my children than I once did. Sarah still rings every Sunday evening. Daniel has become an expert at checking my privacy settings whenever he visits. My grandchildren tease me that I now know more about online scams than they do. They're probably right. Margaret and I still speak at community groups from time to time. After each talk, someone usually stays behind. A widow who's been chatting to a stranger online. A retired gentleman who's embarrassed to admit he's already sent money. Someone worried that asking questions might ruin a relationship. We always tell them the same thing. Real trust welcomes questions. Real friendship doesn't fear transparency. And genuine kindness never depends on secrecy. Growing older doesn't make us foolish. If anything, it reminds us how precious companionship really is. The criminals understood that. They looked for people carrying grief. Not because grief made us weak, but because it made us hopeful. Hopeful that life might still have one unexpected gift waiting for us. As Margaret and I finished our tea, we stood and looked out across the sea one last time. The tide was coming in, slowly washing away the footprints left in the wet sand. Some marks disappear with time. Others become part of who we are. Before we went our separate ways, Margaret smiled and said, "Take care of yourself." "You too." As I watched her walk towards her car, I realized something that had taken me far too long to understand. Loneliness hadn't made either of us weak. It had simply made us believe that kindness could never be dangerous. So, if one day someone appears who seems to understand every lonely corner of your heart, and they ask you for just one small favor, will you recognize the moment when kindness ends and deception quietly begins?